Hello, and good afternoon to everyone joining us in the UK or throughout Europe. Good morning to anyone in North America. Good very late evening slash very early morning to anyone in Asia. Today, we're going to kick off our Ancient Geopolitics series with a conversation with Professor Ali Ansari, who's Professor of History at the University of St. Andrews, and who's going to talk to us today a bit about ancient and sort of early medieval time period history in Iran and the way that that history is used or mobilized in the present day, I believe. But really anything he wants. So I'll turn it over to him now to talk for as long as he'd like about those topics, and then we'll come back with some questions, answers, and discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Bill. I mean, what I was going to talk about really is to look at the ways in which the sort of understanding of ancient Iran has affected the way in which modern politicians, by which, when I mean modern politicians, by the way, modern statesmen, I'm really talking about the period from the 19th century onwards, or actually even earlier. We could talk about the 18th century onwards. You know, the way in which they reflected on the ancient past and how it affected the way in which they worked in the present. And it's quite clear that Iran's sort of pre-Islamic past, be it both its mythical or its real pre-Islamic past, has had a profound effect on the way in which statesmen have viewed Iran's role in the world, but also the sort of sphere of influence in which they sort of believe Iran should be able to operate. And, you know, for me, you know, I think in the West, we tend to get very preoccupied with the ancient Persian Empire. I think even the slide, Bill, for this show shows, you know, Persepolis and the Achaemenids. In actual fact, of course, the Achaemenids are not really within Iranian popular memory until the 19th century, certainly at least. It's not the Achaemenids that are really the real influencer in terms of perception. It's actually the Sasanians that are much, much more profound in terms of a sort of an understanding of Iranian geopolitics. So the Sasanian state, the last of the ancient Persian empires before the Arab conquest, basically dominated the Iranian plateau, but also much of the adjoining environs, if I put it. So, you know, bordered by I always say the Euphrates, the Indus, the Oxus, and the up in the Caucasus. And this sort of what we might term today sort of a greater Iran is actually a territory of operation, if you will, a terrain of operation, which has fixated many Iranian kings, certainly in the early modern and later modern period, but also statesmen when they're looking at what is Iran's sphere of operation. And just to show how well ingrained this sort of idea is, you know, one of the fascinating things is that in 1919, at a time after the Great War, when Iran really, in political terms, was at the nadir of its fortunes, I mean, really, in terms of its political power, extremely weak. When the delegation was sent to the Paris Peace Conference, they made all sorts of claims for territorial restitution of areas which they thought they now had rights to sort of claim because of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the collapse of the Russian Empire. So they present this extraordinary, it's a wonderful map actually to the delegates in Paris. In fact, the British delegation and Curzon in particular didn't let the Iranians in precisely for this point, actually, because they sort of said, well, you know, you weren't strictly speaking belligerents, but also your claims are rather fanciful. The claims can only really be understood, actually, if you understand this sort of weight of history, if you will, on the mindset of Iranian statesmen. And what they claimed was this. They claimed everything in Central Asia up to the Oxus. They claimed all the territories in the Caucasus. These are both areas of the Iranian patrimony, if you will. I mean, a greater Iranian patrimony that they'd lost to Russia. But they also then claimed much of Eastern Anatolia, what we would now know as Kurdistan. They weren't too fussed about southern Mesopotamia, southern Iraq. But they were very keen on vast swathes of territory in the north and west. Didn't spend as much time, I have to say, on looking at the territories to the east, which they would definitely have claimed, you know, parts of what are now modern Afghanistan and, as I said, the Indus. But that's because the British Empire was still very much extant and a force to be reckoned with, so they weren't going to challenge that. But I think it's a very powerful example, actually, in that period of how this sort of conception of Iran as an empire of ancient heritage, of antiquity, of, you know, sort of historical provenance, if you will, how it shaped the way in which what we could term, I suppose, modern statesmen understood Iran's role in the world, and what it should do. And of course, we see that also very clearly today in the Islamic Republic. Even in the Islamic Republic, people talk about, really this sort of what would traditionally be called in the Sasanian concept, Iran Shah, the Empire of Iran, Iran Zamin in its modern connotation, which is essentially, as I said, bordered by the Euphrates, the Indus, the Oxus, and the Caucasus. And this is where the Iranians consider to be their near abroad, where they have, basically every right, and not even just a right, by the way, a duty to sort of participate, contribute, and to some extent dominate, I would say. And of course, let's not forget the Persian Gulf, which, obviously underlined in blood there. It's definitely Persian, and that sort of side there also often extends for them on many of those Iranians who have this very historical basis of understanding their own heritage. They also see the southern littoral of the Persian Gulf as being part of that traditional patrimony. And it's a very powerful driver, really, from, I would say, certainly the 17th, 18th century onwards, but it shapes, very influential in shaping the way in which modern Iranian statesmen see the role of Iran in, what we now understand as the Middle East. But it's really this dominance of the Iranian plateau and its hinterland. And that, in a sense, is, it's a geopolitical reflection, obviously, of the ancient Persian state or the Sasanian state, not the Achaemenid state, Bill. I don't want to get people worried that the Iranians are after, the rest of Anatolia and Thrace and all the way. Although I have to say, some of their mucking around in Syria and going up to the Mediterranean seaboard does reflect some of those ambitions. They, on the whole, they're driven, I think, on a more substantive basis, and I think one that has a much more solid historical pedigree, even though obviously it's contested. Historical pedigree is this sort of notion of Iran as a state that dominates the plateau and its hinterland and the plains around it. So whoever dominates that plateau, Iranian plateau, dominates Mesopotamia, dominates the plains in Central Asia, up to the Indus and the Caucasus. And those are the things that I think I find quite interesting in terms of the way in which that sort of geopolitical inheritance, if you will, that ancient geopolitical inheritance, has shaped the narratives and the politics of modern statesmen. For better or worse, I have to say. I mean, I'm not advocating that they should be, but this is basically something that really does influence them. So I hope that as a sort of an introduction, really. But obviously we can have a conversation and feel free also to interrogate that a little bit further.
Wonderful. Thank you very, very much for that introduction. Let me just remind everyone who's out there in the audience that if you have a question to ask, please do so by clicking on the Q&A tab, which will be probably either at the bottom or at the top of your screen, depending on how your team screen is configured. If you type your question there, I will then pose that to Ali once I see it in there. But let me ask a couple of questions first. I guess the first question would be, why the Sasanian Empire in particular and not sort of Islamic iterations of regimes that controlled Iran or earlier empires indeed? I mean, I think if I recall correctly, you even once published an article on the cult of Cyrus the Great, right?
I did.
Yeah. So is the cult of Cyrus the Great in the sense of an earlier Greater Persia, is that really completely missing or much less important in the minds of modern politicians? Or, do they also make reference to that? Do they also make reference to any of the various Islamic kingdoms and sort of multinational states, really, that dominated the region in a slightly later period?
So I think you're absolutely right about the cult of Cyrus the Great. And I mean, obviously, since the late 19th century and certainly in the 20th century, the figure of Cyrus the Great and the Achaemenids have sort of re-entered the Iranian narrative in a much, much more emphatic way. In the sort of the mythical, legendary history of Iran, as inherited really through what we call the Book of Kings, the Shahnameh, it's basically the model is a Sasanian one. It's inherited through a Sasanian tradition. And the notion of Iran Shah, the notion of the Empire of Iran, is the one that's identified most closely with the Sasanians. And what most Iranians, in a popular sense, or if I can look at it that way, what they would have appreciated by their pre-Islamic sort of inheritance was really something that drew on the Shahnameh in a big way, that mythical inheritance. And of course, the Sasanians were pivotal to that. The Achaemenids, interestingly enough, were largely, I don't want to say forgotten. I think in a sense, what I would rather say is they were remembered differently within the popular narratives. The Achaemenids had largely been marginalized in that sense. And prior to the Sasanians as a distinct dynasty, what you had, as dynasties were dynasties that basically, if you went back far enough, were rulers of the world. I mean, these were sort of global rulers. They were not just rulers of Iran. So, that obviously, if we're thinking of it as a sort of geopolitical context, doesn't really quite have the same impact, because obviously, if you're ruling the entire world, there are no sort of distinctions there to draw. But certainly, I think the importance of Cyrus the Great, even in the Achaemenids in the 20th century, and even in the Islamic Republic, I have to say, have become very, very important, influential, and they color the way Iranians will see the world. So Ahmadinejad, for instance, the very eclectic, if I may say so, idiosyncratic president under the Islamic Republic, who succeeded by fair means or foul President Khatami, 2005, he had a very sort of emotional attachment, not only to the myths and mythologies of the Shahnameh, but also he felt to Cyrus the Great. He was very sort of attached to this figure of Cyrus the Great. The Islamic Republic, of course, reintegrated Cyrus the Great into the narrative. They made him a good Muslim, for instance, very anachronistic, but they managed it somehow. But of course, in geopolitical terms, and if we're talking about geopolitical terms, the notion of the Achaemenid Empire as a basis for action is much more problematic, obviously, in terms of the vastness of the Achaemenid Empire is not something that any modern ruler in Iran would really, they might aspire to it, but it's not something that's going to happen. I mean, you can't, when you think of the size of the Achaemenid empires from the Oxus all the way to the Nile, further on into Libya, and then obviously into Thrace and other. I mean, it's just it's not functional as a political project. Whereas the Sasanian concept of Iran and its near abroad, because I have to say, Bill, because of the munificence of George W. Bush and his global war on terror, basically breaking out in Iraq and Afghanistan, he allowed, in a sense, the Iranians to put their imaginations into practice, if I can put it that way. So what they had an understanding of this sort of notion of the Empire of Iran suddenly becomes a possibility when you find that Saddam Hussein has gone, the Taliban have been knocked out, at least temporarily, and the fact is Iranian influence can extend both east and west. And Iranian influence does. I mean, it expands, and it's a very interesting expansion. The way they justify it, of course, and this is the interesting thing, is they justify their interventions in Mesopotamia because it is Mesopotamia. They don't talk of it really as Iraq. They don't talk of it necessarily as an Arab country. Do you see what I mean? I mean, there's a lot of Arabs would sort of say to them, well, what are you doing there in an Arab country? They'd say, well, I mean, it's this is part of the natural patrimony of the land of Iran. So in that respect, I think, the Achaemenids, you're quite right, do play a role, but they play, I think, what we might call a moral role rather than a practical role. I think the Sasanians, because of the realities at the moment on the ground, the Sasanian image has played is more emphatic. And of course, when you go to the Islamic states that we were talking about, what the Iranians do is they aspire. The Sasanians, of course, are the last of the great distinctly Persian empire, so Iranians will tend to aspire to that. But of course, the other empires they look at are the Safavid Empire in the 16th and 17th century. But of course, in a geopolitical sense, the Safavid Empire also at its highest extent, not at its normal extent, at its largest extent, also mirrored in that sense the geopolitical boundaries of the Sasanian state. So again, what you have is a state that is based on the plateau that controls its hinterland. But of course, the Safavids never really were able to exert long-term control over Mesopotamia, for instance, or long-term control over parts of the southern Persian Gulf. But what they did have was control over the Caucasus. They did have control, for instance, over parts of Central Asia and Afghanistan, but then, of course, that contracted. But again, that shape of the state, the Safavids and the Sasanians, there are strong there are strong analogies, mirror images. I don't know what the right phrase is, but you know what I mean. I mean, it reflects that geopolitical reality of that power that dominates the plateau can dominate its hinterland.
I mean, it's very interesting also this broader idea that this self-image of a state gets frozen in a sense at a certain moment in its history. And it isn't always obvious to me why that is or when that should be, right? So if we think, in China, the sort of self-conception of what the borders of China should look like are roughly what they were in about 1780. Right, at about that moment during the Qing dynasty. If we picked an earlier period, they might be bigger, they might be quite a bit smaller, and look quite different in terms of which exact areas they included. Likewise, even France, right, for all of the sort of cult of Charlemagne and so much of French history and political rhetoric, right, the borders of France as self-conceived are really, from about the 12th century, not the 9th. Right, and have very little to do with Charlemagne, but with much later kings, right? So, in that sense, it still seems maybe arbitrary, but maybe actually that there's some kind of a broader internal logic to when societies choose to self-define what the borders of the state or of their influence ought to be from their history, because many states change quite a bit, as indeed Iran.
Absolutely. I think in the Iranian case, one of the striking things is it has a sort of a literary tradition that backs it. Do you know what I mean? Now, that literary tradition can be quite vague, I have to say. I mean, sometimes if you look at some of the sort of geographers of the Middle Ages, when they talk about, the Empire of Iran, they definitely include within the Empire of Iran parts of, the Nile. I mean, and people sort of say, well, when was the last time we were anywhere near the Nile? Well, it would have been in the later Sasanian period, but only temporarily. But by and large, when medieval Iranian geographers look at what they consider to be the borders of the Empire of Iran, it is broadly speaking, and again, these things are not exact, are they? Is broadly speaking what you would understand by the Sasanian Empire.
Right. Well, now we have a question in from the audience, and again, I remind members of the audience, please do pose your questions in writing via the Q&A tab. This first question says, how would you characterize Russian-Iranian relations today from a historical perspective? How normal or unusual are they based on sort of longer trends in history, and what drives these trends?
Well, I mean, based on longer trends in history, they're very unusual. They're unusually warm, I have to say, because normally in the longer stretch of history, I mean, Russian-Iranian relations have been pretty fractious and pretty tense. I mean, they have occasionally warmed, but it's normally warmed because the Russians are basically bullying the Persians in one sense or another. But what's fascinating is that at the beginning of the relationships between Iran and Russia, if you go back to the period of when Russia was defined as Muscovy, when the Muscovite ambassadors were coming down to Isfahan to set up trading posts in the Safavid Empire, they were treated very, very roughly, very, very roughly. And in the Persian conception, in the Iranian conception, they were known as the Uzbeks of the West. So basically, the Uzbeks of Europe, essentially. I mean, and I can assure you that was a very detrimental. It was a very condescending comment, really. I mean, they thought they were not really quite up there with the French or the English or the Portuguese or the Spanish. So it was the relationship was very much favored in that sense, the Persians. Of course, by the end of the 18th century and after the military revolution, and once the Russians start to seize territory essentially in the Caucasus and start to make military advances, the shock of the realization among the Iranian elite that the Uzbeks of the West are basically the people who are causing them the most grief. It means that the relationship obviously has to take on a new character. I mean, obviously the Iranians have to adapt to new realities, but they find it very difficult to adapt to these new realities. And of course, their relationship with the Russians was always a very tense one, because the Russians throughout the 19th century had always been a threat to Iran's borders and territorial sovereignty. So the idea now, for instance, that the Iranians and the Russians are allies is a very, very unusual one. And I think many people would still say that the Iranians and the Russians still don't trust each other at all, but have been sort of pushed together by necessity on one level, But I think also, actually, interesting enough, because there is a sort of a congealing of the military-industrial complex between the two countries, and it's essentially the Islamic Revolutionary Guards and the sort of the relevant Russian military units. And I mean, not to be too blunt about it, really the mafias on each side have bound themselves very closely to each other, and so even though they really don't like each other, they find a utility in a shared relationship.
That actually provides a segue into another question I was thinking about asking you, which is about contestation of these historical visions.
Yeah.
Right. So are there historically or in a more contemporary context particular factions that would favor one type of sort of historical self-conception of the nation versus another? And how have those divisions played out? Is there any sort of general trend as to, political actors A, B, and C tend to like a more expansive definition or an older definition, and DC and E want a narrower one or a more modern one? Is there anything?
I think there are various different types of different types of nationalist thought in Iran. I don't think all of it is particularly well developed, but I'd have to say I think the nationalist thought that now permeates among Iranian society in Iran is in some ways more developed than the nationalist sort of sentiments that you'll get among the diaspora outside Iran. And the reason I say that is because obviously those in Iran are living with the reality of their choices and what they're doing and what the consequences of those things will be. So I think the nationalist movement, in a sense, those who are shaping a form of national identity in Iran today, are much more secular in their outlook, much more secular than they used to be. So at the beginning of the revolution, they would have been much more happy with a sort of what we might define a religious nationalism, the idea that one was a Shia and a Persian were sort of like seen as interchangeable. Now that is no longer the case. I mean, there's now a clear distinction. I think almost all people who aspire to some sort of national identity in Iran or a nationalist agenda, in a sense, all tend to be, how should we say, expansive in terms of the glories and benefits of Persian culture. I have to say, I think you'll find very few Iranians who will tell you that you will not benefit, Bill, from really, supping at the table of Iranian culture, and they'll want to tell you all about it. I think within the country itself, there are obviously different, and others, there are different strands who are, political or what we may even call imperial nationalists of one sort or another. I think there's quite a lot of people, my reading of it certainly is that probably quite a few people are very proud of their Iranian identity, very proud of their sort of national identity in that sense, but do not harbor what we would call a sort of fascistic tendencies that were ascribed to sort of nationalisms in the 1930s, for instance, sort of very expansionist and whatever. There are some. I mean, every country has them. There are those even within the Islamic Republic that have very sort of imperial connotations of where the country should and should not be going. But, distinguishing between the two major strands we have today, which are the religious and the secular nationalists, I would say the secular nationalists, who are probably dominant among society, are probably, in my view, certainly not imperial in pretension. They like the fact that their country should be more recognized, I think, as in terms of a civilizational state even, but they're not politically, that determined to export the revolution, if you will. I mean, for their part, they'd be quite happy to live in peace and just get on with things and make the country as they have it work properly, which obviously at the moment it doesn't. So I mean, there are definitely interesting strands, and there are, as with all ideologies, there are those who are more extreme and more radical than others.
That's actually a good segue as well into another audience question that's just come in, which says, would you say that Iran's self-perception as an ancient great power influences relations with China as an equal, quote unquote, ancient civilization? And I guess you could add to that, relations with other sort of self-styled ancient civilizations like Turkey, India, Egypt, Greece, etc. Are there particular
they do. I mean, they see themselves. Yeah, I mean, they see themselves really in a trilateral relationship, as to be said, with China, India, and themselves. That's who they see themselves. And interestingly, if you go back into the historical records, for instance, in the 17th century, when English or French at the time merchants there was a very famous, I mean, he was Huguenot, so he was sort of Anglo-French in a sense. Sir John Chardin wrote his account, his travels in Persia. He notes in there very interestingly that when you talk to the Persians, they very emphatically tell, this is what we'd call about 1680. He says very emphatically that the Persians think that their kingdom is the oldest dominion in the world. And by virtue of being the oldest dominion in the world, the one that has prior authority over every other kingdom. So they basically see their kingdom as the oldest. And by virtue of being the oldest, and by virtue of being the most ancient, the best. I mean, that bit about the best is implicit, okay? And they sort of say, yes, we've had our ups and downs and things aren't particularly necessarily looking pretty good now, but, sooner or later we'll recapture all those territories that we may have lost. So I think what's interesting about the Iranians is they do, and I think you're absolutely right, they see themselves, even though they're not on a par on any other level with the Chinese, they do see themselves in civilizational terms and as a sort of an ancient state as on a par with the Chinese, and they also see themselves to some extent with the Indians. Interestingly enough, the other countries you talk about, they don't actually compare themselves, particularly with the Turks or the Egyptians, even though, frankly, they should certainly with the Egyptians, but they don't. It doesn't really come up. They will talk about, I mean, these days now, of course, because of politics, they'll talk a little bit about Russia, but that doesn't, obviously not really count, but they will talk about that. But really, in terms of their sort of Eurasian powers, it's India, China, and themselves. These are the three great civilizational powers who really should obviously all have seats on the UN Security Council by virtue of being old.
Or old, or I mean, if we think of sort of a very broad and simplistic conception of kind of ancient geopolitics spheres of influence, you could think of sort of East, West, / Central and South Asia, and sort of three great powers of Asia with broad spheres of influence in different parts of this huge continent. That, I can sort of see that, although that does seem a little bit facile, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, it's it's this. How should we say? It's a sort of a nationalist, a cultural nationalist sort of agenda, and I think what drives the Iranians, and I think this is a very, very powerful drive for many Iranians, irrespective of the political realities, is they do feel, with some justification, it has to be said, that their cultural contributions to world history and world civilization have not been properly acknowledged. So they're constantly trying to push for that. So in that sort of sense, they do see that they do, and that would be whether it was the Shah or the Islamic Republic, whatever. I mean, that would apply to all. They do see themselves. It's very interesting, when the first British ambassadors went to Iran in the early 19th century, and they were signing treaties with the Persian king. They developed this very sort of lengthy treaty preamble that basically distinguished the British monarch, George III at the time, from the Persian king by granting the Persian king in this preamble dominion over the earth, whereas George III had dominion over the seas. And therefore, they weren't conflicting with each other. They were compatible. They were on the same level. But you clearly see the aspiration there is extraordinary when you think about it, given the realities of power and the disparities of power even between Britain and Iran in the early 1800s.
And that does seem to speak to something more philosophical than just defining a land power and a maritime power, for example. It's bigger than that.
No, it is absolutely bigger than that, and it comes. When I talk to colleagues who look, even during the Arab conquest of Iran in the 7th century, one of the striking things about that is how quickly Persian culture begins to reassert itself. And how does it reassert itself? In many ways, because many of the Arab conquerors who go in want to adopt, sort of Persian genealogies, names, titles, and as one of my colleagues used to say, it signals a sort of a tremendous cultural confidence, really, on the part of the Persians. And this is where presumably the geopolitics comes in. And I always say this to people. I say, we look at the 7th century as this sort of epistemological break almost, as if somehow everything changes with the Arab conquest and the arrival of Islam. But of course, the Persians were in dominion, effectively, of what would become the Eastern Caliphate, i.e., Mesopotamia, Iran, whatever, for 1,000 years. And 1,000 years has got to have its consequences. I mean, it's going to leave traces, right? It's going to have an impact. You don't suddenly find an Arab Muslim conquest and everything is washed away. It's simply not going to happen. what you have is a legacy, and a very profound legacy, that influences generations to come. So, even in the caliphate, for instance, it's very clear that a lot of the administration and a lot of the political thinking is being done by Persian, Iranian scribes, bureaucrats, and ministers of one sort, of viziers, and they have a profound influence on the way things shape. I mean, of course they are. They're bound to. And not all of them are Muslim, by the way. Some of them are Buddhist, some of them are Zoroastrian. Some, but they serve the caliph, and they get on with it. And there's a wonderful account which I cite in one of my books somewhere of an Arab satirist, Al-Jahiz, has a sort of a caricature of a Persian bureaucrat, and it's both scathing but also very enlightening, because it basically portrays this Persian bureaucrat from the 9th. I mean, think about it there. I mean, this is like from about 850 AD. So it's like 200 years after the collapse of the Sasanian Empire. Yeah. With a scribe sitting there saying, things were run so much better under the Sasanians. I mean, actually he puts those words into his mouth. It tells you something. It tells you something.
I mean, that's really interesting about this kind of assimilation of the conquering power. Yeah. I mean, that to me is reminiscent of at least later accounts and sort of historiography of what happened in China under the Yuan, as well as under the Qing, the two greatest dynasties by many measures that were both foreign. Or foreign conquest, right? The Mongolian and Manchurian dynasties. And it sounds a bit similar in that sense.
But am I right in saying that the Chinese eventually expelled the Mongols? Is that right? Or did they expel them?
Well, eventually the dynasty collapsed after not that long a period. Actually, less than 200 years, if I remember correctly. It was not a very long time. As was true of a lot of
Iranian case. They sort of, in the Iranian case, they sort of were absorbed into the body politic and to sort of disappear. But it sounds to me, Bill, it's quite similar, really. Both cultures effectively absorb it.
Or I mean, or at least even being seen by the conquering power as in some way particularly important, legitimate, useful, attractive, whatever it might be, because of that perception of an ancient society, culture, political system, system of thought, language, etc., all of those things, right? That actually is also a good link into another question that's coming from the audience, which says, does the nature of the collapse of the Sasanian Empire feed into the popular remembering today?
Does the nature of the collapse? Yes. Yes and no. I mean, I have to say that I don't think, the study of history in Iran is really where it should be. So what you're seeing really is a lot of popular history. And of course, the collapse of the Sasanians is a sort of a bittersweet moment for Iranians, because in traditional speaking, I mean, when I say traditional speaking, in the prior to the Islamic Revolution, of course, one of the things they had to try and explain, and a lot of people did when they're arguing, was that actually the collapse of the Sasanian Empire was a natural order of things. It just had to happen. And that the rise of Islam was, ordained by God, and it was right and proper, for instance, that the Iranians accepted Islam so willingly. Now, what's happened really interestingly with the Islamic Republic is what they did is they pumped in quite a bit of money, research money, to get people to study the rise of Islam. It was very important for them. They wanted to get proper scholarship on the rise of Islam, and a lot of these sort of students went off to sort of interrogate the sources. What they discovered, of course, is that actually the collapse of the Sasanians was a much more bloody affair than people had realized. It wasn't quite so much, the Iranians willingly accepting this new religion. I mean, it was a real fight. I mean, it was the dynasty certainly collapsed. The dynasty collapsed in a number of battles that it lost. The Sasanians fled east, actually, Bill. You'll be interested to know that a number of Sasanian princes then end up becoming generals in the Chinese army or somewhere. Some of them are buried, actually. Yeah, it's really, they found graves, actually. And they are the Sasanian grave. They're the Sasanian dynasty, and they've gone and they basically immersed themselves in China. But interestingly, in terms of the culture and society in Iran, the conquest was a much, much slower affair than people had originally really realized. And I think what's interesting today, in terms of the sort of national, the resurgence and a sort of a more secular national identity that I was talking about, is people are now reviewing that period with a much more sympathetic, if I may say so, stance towards the Sasanians, And one of the things I found, for instance, is in popular atlases, historical atlases that they're now issuing. So originally, if you go back 50 years and you look at an atlas of the period, the atlas will say the rise of Islam, the conquest of Islam. Now they don't talk about that. Now they say the Arab conquest. I mean, they just talk about the Arab conquest. They don't talk about Islam. They talk about it as an Arab thing. And I find that sort of subtle change is quite an interesting one, because it sort of reflects that change in mood. And of course, traditionally, very traditionally, if you go back to the Shahnameh and the Book of Kings I was talking to you about, of course, the Shahnameh is in many ways at the end, the last elements of this great epic are a great lament on the loss of the Sasanian Empire. And I know people they say, oh, well, the poet Ferdowsi was actually a good Muslim. Yes and no. I mean, if you look at actually his text, he definitely laments the loss of the old Persian civilization as he sees it, the loss of the old Sasanians. And there's a wonderful letter that he ascribes to one of the Sasanian commanders who, it's a very, very melancholy piece of literature where he talks about the collapse of, he says, henceforth, the pulpit will replace the throne, and basically everything will be back to front. Everything will be back to front. Honest men will be imprisoned, thieves will become rulers, all sorts of things. It's all back to front. This is not someone who's overly enamored with what's happened. I mean, this is something. So that lament is there. And I think, in fact, that very traditional understanding of the collapse of the Sasanian Empire is now re-emerging in more secular histories, that are, and in some ways popular histories, but secular histories that are coming out again. And that collapse of the Sasanians is seen as in a much more melancholy light than maybe the Islamic Republic would want you to believe.
Yeah, I mean, that also speaks to a kind of generalized sort of nostalgic melancholia around conceptions of an ancient state or an ancient society. And I think that also travels beyond the Iranian case. But is that something maybe that comes up with some regularity, like the scribe 200 years later saying things were so much better back in the Sasanian times, and maybe even today some people sort of indicating perhaps things were better at that time. Is this kind of backwards looking lamentation of better times in this more distant earlier period? Is that a common theme, and is it always the Sasanians?
But you see, this is the interesting thing about them, and this is when we're going back to the uses and abuses of history. Of course, what people do is they use this history by analogy. Okay, so they say, I lament the collapse of Sasanian civilization. What they're really talking about, in some ways, is actually they're lamenting the fall of the Shah and the rise of the Islamic Revolution. But they don't want to say that directly. They say it indirectly, and they talk about it through a historical lens. And so they'll say, and that's why, in many ways, this history is so political. I mean, the Islamic Republic does it in its own ideology, of course. It draws on these analogies, mainly from Islamic history, to draw analogies with its own present. I mean, obviously, it does that. But one of the interesting things about Iran is this real dichotomy that it has between its what we might call strictly Persian inheritance and then its religious, Muslim inheritance, and the two different narratives that shape that. One is an Abrahamic narrative, the other is a non-Abrahamic narrative. I mean, there are two myths of descent. There are two creation myths that sit side by side, basically. And what I find quite interesting as a historian is to see which narrative, in terms of that folklore of descent, that myth of creation, whatever, which is becoming dominant in people's minds. And the way I see it, certainly, but others may disagree, but the way I see it is that what you're seeing really is a rebalancing of that situation where the Iranian myth of descent is dominating again. That's not to say people will ignore the Islamic myth of descent, but they see that more as a sort of they pigeonhole that under sort of religious services, whatever. But always remember, of course, Bill, that the dominant, by some measure, it has to be said, holiday in the Iranian calendar is a Zoroastrian festival. It's the Zoroastrian New Year. It's not a Muslim festival at all.
Right.
And whenever the New Year, the Persian New Year, which is normally the 20th of March, the vernal equinox, when it clashes with the religious festival, you can bet your bottom dollar, I have to say, that it's the religious festival that's going to be ignored by ordinary people.
Yeah.
And we see that in the historical record going back, brother. That's what's quite interesting about it. that, you know, the state often has to give this impression of paying attention to that religious holiday, and it will do it officially, but they will also acknowledge the fact that actually people want to have a bit of fun and enjoy themselves in the new year and whatever. And that is something that reminds people that they are distinct. They are distinct. They are Muslims, but they're Persian Muslims. And as Persian Muslims, they have a different and distinct inheritance.
That is rather interesting. And it's also interesting that it doesn't seem, I mean, there's a particular genius, therefore, I think, of the early Christian church in Europe of co-opting Roman holidays and Celtic holidays and Germanic holidays into the religious calendar of the new hegemonic religion. Doesn't seem that was quite
They
as...
tried to do it. They tried to do it, actually. So first of all, it's interesting in the record when you look at it. First of all, they banned these festivals. You know, it's a standard. And don't do these pagan things. It's terrible, blah, blah.
Right.
Then it doesn't work. So then they tax it. Okay, you can do it, but you're going to pay tax for it. And then they adopt it. And they adopt it as one of their own. But what's interesting about it, and this is, you're quite right, I think the early Christian church is much more successful. They adopt it, but they adopt it as a Persian festival. They don't adopt it as a Muslim festival. Do you see what I mean?
Yes.
Even though they try and do it, and that is quite striking. I mean, you're absolutely right. It's quite distinct from what happens, say, for instance, in you know, Latin Christendom, where you get quite a few pagan rituals are sort of like repackaged, reformed, although I must admit my experts on Christian theology will disagree with me on that, but you know, clearly there is some sort of pagan, you know, so there are some elements there which are quite interesting. But interestingly, as I said, with it has retained its character as a distinctly pre-Islamic festival.
There's a couple more audience questions that I want to be sure I get a chance
I'm impressed by the number of people online. Actually,
it's very good.
Friday evening. Yeah.
That and more people continue to log in, and no one seems to be logging off. So I'm very pleased by this so far. So thank you, audience members, for bearing with us and for the questions you continue to pose. So here's another one from the audience, which says, would you argue that an important historical and contemporary rival of Iran is Turkey? And what is or has been at stake in leadership or hegemony over the Middle East and or Central Asia? I guess maybe it could be quite a different dynamic between Iran and Turkey in Central Asia versus in the Middle East. I'm not sure. I'm agnostic.
So, I mean, the last Shah was it was quite interesting. I remember one of the last British ambassadors in Iran said that, you know, the Shah made a great play about, you know, being on the front line of the Cold War and all this sort of thing. And he would say to the Americans, give me more tanks because I need to cope with the Soviets and this sort of thing. But apparently the Shah privately said, for 500 years, the greatest enemies of my country have come from the West. And, you know, basically he was fingering Saddam Hussein, of course. He sort of said, if the Iraqis have 500 tanks, I need 1,000. Now, what he was saying, which is quite important, of course, is that the greatest competition, the greatest rivalry to the Persian state were the Ottomans. And the Ottoman Empire was quite clearly a rival in a way that the Mughals were not, you know, because of the distance and whatever. So the Ottomans, there was a lot of rivalry there. And then I think you're quite right to say that the Turkish Republic also has posed an interesting ideological and ethnic threat, because obviously large portions of the Iranian state are made of is composed of ethnic Turks, or Turkic, I should say. I want to distinguish that from, you know, the Turks of the Turkish Republic, you know, in that sense, because obviously the Turks have acquired that ethnicity almost exclusive for them. But of course, in a traditional sense, you know, Turkic peoples were spread all over the Middle East, certainly the northern Middle East. So Turkey posed a very, very real threat in the early days of the rise of nationalisms in the Middle East, particularly, you know, under Ataturk and stuff, because Turkey developed this notion of, you know, also pan-Turkism, and this sort of engendered a reaction among Iranian nationalists of pan-Iranism, you know, and this sort of thing, and they competed. And you're quite right to say that with the fall of the Soviet Union, of course, all these sort of rivalries came back to haunt everyone when they started to compete over influence in Central Asia and Caucasia. And one of the great anomalies, I have to say, and great paradoxes of our modern age has been this sort of competition in the Caucasus. So the Azeris, the Republic of Azerbaijan, are Shia, but have allied themselves and made very explicit sense that they are Turkic and see themselves as allied to the Turks, even though in an ethnic sense or whatever, their brethren are basically in much of what is the province of Azerbaijan and Iran. I mean, there's obviously clear links between the two. But whereas the Armenians, who are Christian, made big play on the fact that actually they were sort of basically Christian Iranians and we're all Iranian together. So what you found in the contestation between Azerbaijan and Armenia, certainly in the 1990s, in Nagorno-Karabakh and stuff, that Shia Iran backed Christian Armenia over Shia Azerbaijan, who was backed by secular Turkey. I mean, so that sort of thing was really quite peculiar. And of course, you see that competition in Central Asia as well, where people tried to sort of like, the Turks obviously wanted to play on their linguistic and ethnic affinity, and the Iranians wanted to play much more on their cultural, affinity. And it was there. As it happens, really, I mean, both sides have really lost out to the Russians, who maintained a far better grip on the area than either side could have really achieved. But the one area where the Iranians are much more influential, I suppose, is Tajikistan. And because obviously the Tajiks are effectively Persian speaking, and in some parts of Uzbekistan where you have Persian speaking in Samarkand and Bukhara and those sort of urban centers. But yeah, I mean, that competition is certainly there, and it's a historic one.
And it's interesting also, the last part of your answer also brings up this idea of competing narratives. Yeah. Sort of a religious-based narrative, a culturally-based narrative, or maybe a politically-based narrative, an economically-based narrative. There could be several different narratives in play, sometimes manipulated quite self-consciously by the actors, I think, that can feed into this kind of rivalry.
I think they are. I mean, I think the interesting thing with the narratives, of course, is they tend to sort of twist them to suit their purpose, of course.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the thing. And they, all ideologies, as I try to explain even to, when we talk to our students, ideologies are not, ideologies are there to make something illogical logical. But in the process of making it logical is not necessarily logical, if I can put it that way. I mean, they sort of square the circle, but they square the circle by forcing the square into the circle. And just giving some sort of explanation of what they're doing. So, the absurdity of the sort of Azeri-Armenian bust-up and the way in which the Turks and the Iranians split down the middle on that, it wasn't what people who always believed in the Islamic Republic of Iran or Iran as a Shia state would have naturally assumed would be the case. I do think, though, I will say this, as I think that analysts have consistently misread what Iran is about. Do you see what I mean? So yes. The Iranians will present themselves, the official, I'm talking about the established elite, the political elite, the Islamic Republic, always present themselves as a very, theocratic religious state. And of course, on many different levels they are. I'm not denying that. But they're more than happy, as we saw under Ahmadinejad, to borrow all sorts of paraphernalia from various other sort of ideologies, nationalism and other things, and to use different means to get their ends, which are driven at the end of the day by sort of a political geography, as in a sense, that sort of thing of them as distinctly Iranian at the end of the day. But yeah, they manipulate their narratives with wild abandon, I have to say. Some of it is just not logical at all.
Well, I think that could be said for any narrative manipulation, probably in most countries. That's it.
Absolutely.
Here's another audience question that's a bit provocative, especially in the context of what you were saying earlier about this idea of enemies coming from the West. So current geopolitical thought focuses on Sparta and Athens, the so-called Thucydides trap. Yeah. What about Persia? I should say, but actually, before you answer that question, we have not yet booked specifically an Ancient Geopolitics session on the Peloponnesian War, although I hope to. And this whole formulation of the Thucydides trap, I find personally quite problematic as it's been deployed in current geopolitical debates. But what would you say then about Persia in that context of sort of recasting ancient Greece and Greek history? And I guess, is there a Xerxes trap if there is a Thucydides trap?
Well, there is. This is a fascinating. So when we were talking about this podcast, I did say to you that I said, one of the problems I have is there isn't really enough material. It's not like I can go and read a text, an ancient Persian text that's discussing about, war and rationale, because these things just simply don't exist from a Persian side of it. But there is an interesting argument to be said that there is quite a lot of interesting material in the Greek sources, and particularly things like Xenophon's Chiropedia and others that he talks about. Now, this wouldn't necessarily affect geopolitics as we would understand it, but at least it sort of gives you perception of what they understand kingship to be and governance to be. And I'm very much in favor, I'm not sure quite how we do it, but I'm very much in favor in a sense of, yes, redrawing some of those ideas or rethinking some of those ideas in the context that obviously the Greeks at the time were operating within, for better or worse, was Pax Persica. I mean, you know, this is what they were operating under. And I think it would be good, actually, in some ways, to rethink some of those. And I entirely agree with you, Bill, by the way that, you know, modern people have taken the various lessons of the past in that sense and sort of applied it to our modern concept of China or whatever. Right? I mean, I think that's quite right. And I think it would be great, though, certainly from for a better understanding, in a sense, of the geopolitics of the ancient world. In that sense, if we were able to bring Persia back in, now how you do that is a separate, you know, it's a separate question. I don't know quite how we do that, but clearly, you know, I don't think you can understand some of the Greek discussions about politics, geopolitics, warfare, whatever, outside the context of the world in which they operated in. And the world in which they operated in was, you know, pretty emphatically, even I would say, with Alexander, I resist the temptation. I resist to call him the Great, but you know, but let's call him Alexander the whatever. Even he, you know, at the end of the day, aspired to be a Persian monarch. I mean, you know, and that's why his men fell out with him effectively. I mean, you know, because basically he sort of came into this and he was absorbed by it. I mean, he was
obsessed
blown away
with
by
Darius, right, for a long time as he was beginning to invade the Persian Empire.
When he takes over, you know, he sort of says this is a sort of a revenge for the attacks on the Acropolis and the Parthenon. But then when he goes into the body of the Persian Empire and straight into sort of Mesopotamia and goes in, he starts to begin to appreciate the Persians on a quite different level. And so that by the end of his life, you know, one of the criticisms his men have of him, of course, is that you become quite Persian. Now, the interesting thing from a Persian side, of course, is that in that great narrative I was telling you about, the great Book of Kings, when you look in the Book of Kings, Alexander actually becomes a Persian prince. I mean, we've effectively adopted him and made him Persian. You know, he's the sort of you know, his father is he's a renegade prince out in what they would call then in Rome. I mean, it was called, the world was called Rome. But they see him as essentially a Persian prince coming to get his patrimony back.
Maybe almost like the Caliphate 1,000 years later, or
I mean,
800 years later.
I mean, I think the interesting thing is that there were two singular challenges to Persian self-confidence, if I can put it that way. One was the Muslim conquest, which took centuries to sort of absorb and shape whatever they did it. And the other, of course, is the challenge of the West, which, to be honest, is an ongoing struggle. I mean, they haven't really been able to understand how to handle this. Almost everything else, from Alexander to the Mongols to the Turks, they've been able in some way or form to absorb. And you know, I'd even say that with the Arab Muslim conquest, they absorbed it too. But it is clearly the absorption hasn't been 100%. Let's put it that way. There's still a distinction there. There's still a distinction there.
Well, let's see. We're almost out of time. There are a couple other audience questions, but rather than take those, I also want to give you a chance, Ali, just to say anything else that you'd like to say by way of conclusion, or we can go into another audience question.
I think going to the questions, actually, to be honest, because that always feeds my
sure.
thinking.
Okay. Sure. So there is another interesting question here, which says, on the Iranian myth of descent, how would you say that India features in that? And if India is another one of these great civilizational states, does India play any role or figure into that myth of descent at all?
I mean, it does play a role in terms of the modern conception of the civilizational states, but it doesn't really feature within the narrative of descent. Because in the narrative of descent, what you get is the first man and woman, the first kings who are kings of the world. Then they sort of gradually, there's a period of, interestingly enough, of I think the first, let me get this right, let me get the right order of things. So when the last, that's right. So you get one of the great kings who mythologically speaking, or sets up all the daily order of life and stuff, which actually does share a lot of similarities, by the way, with Indian mythology, but it's not ascribed with it. I mean, there is a sort of a common Aryan heritage there between it is definitely Indo-Aryan in that sense. So there's there, but and you'll get that very clearly, but it's not explicitly said in that Book of Kings. So Jamshid is a figure that would be familiar in some ways, I think, to Indian mythology as well, under a slightly different connotation of the name. But the fall of Jamshid then leads to a period of a very dark period under what they call the rule of the Arab tyrant, the Dragon King. And then ultimately you get this sort of uprising, a period of enlightenment, a new king. And this new king, who's again the king of the world, eventually then splits up his inheritance into his three sons. And this is actually very tribal, of course. I mean, it's a wonderful, you can read between the lines, because the three sons, it is the youngest son who gets the plum part of the territory. So one son gets the east, basically Turan, one son gets the west, i.e. the Romans, and one son gets the plum piece in the middle, Iran. And the way the fighting between East, West, and Iran is portrayed in this narrative, very poignant actually in some ways, is the fact that the two elder brothers are so jealous of the younger brother for having got the plum piece that they murder him and throw throw the carcass in front of their father, who's like, has a sort of bit like King Lear, sort of
the whole story sounds like King Lear, actually.
Yeah,
quite a bit. Yeah.
And I mean, it's very dramatic stuff. But of course, what I find quite interesting about it is it shows that the fight between East, West, and Iran is fratricidal. It's within the family. You know what I mean? I mean, it's much different from the Herodotean sort of notion of the battle between East and West. But again, that's it. So those are the sort of the areas that basically feature in that great narrative. Those are the areas. And I think if you were to look at Indian civilization, it's definitely there. It's undoubtedly there, but it's part of the context, if I can put it that way. It's part of the sort of the background.
Right. I mean, was there anything else that you wanted to say by way of conclusion then, Ali?
No, I'm fine. I think I've got all those now. I'm just wondering if I've made any huge mistakes in any of that, but I don't think I have. I think I'm okay.
No, I think I'm very impressed.
It's Friday evening, though.
This is an incredibly wide-ranging and detailed discussion of so many different periods, themes, ideas, and events. It's been really a lot of fun for me, and I assume for most of our audience, because they've stayed.
Well, that's very good, and it's very good of you to stay on a Friday evening, if I may say so. It's very kind of you.
Well, and of you as well to do this with us on a Friday.
Yeah, but thank you, Bill. Thank you. Is this the inaugural one?
It is. It's the very first in the Ancient Geopolitics series.
It's good for the Persians to be first, eh, Bill?
Yeah.
That's what we like. Yeah.
Well, as perhaps the oldest kingdom that gets the oldest.
I must add this to my list with Tom Holland. I have to get back to them and tell them that we've got another first.
Yes. Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much, Ali. Thank you very much, everyone in the audience. And thanks. Good night.